What's up, guys? Welcome into the Fireside Bears YouTube channel. Usayd alongside Max Smith here. You can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at FireSideBears. Make sure you're following myself and Max on Twitter at Usayd and at Max Smith ESM. And for the second consecutive time, the Chicago Bears have decided that they're going to go ahead and hire a general manager with the initials RP. Earlier today, it was reported that the Bears are closing in on a deal to make Chiefs Executive Director of Player Personnel Ryan Poles the team's next general manager. And Max, how you doing first off? And then let's just get right into this, man.
It's so cold where I am right now, and I'm not used to it. So I'm cozied up right now. I've been like this for the past 2 days. I live down in the south, so we're getting hit with the winter storm. And I grew up in Chicago, went to high school outside Chicago. It's tough for me to lose my sense of bodily heat. It's really demasculating. But it is what it is. I know if I ever go back up north, it's going to absolutely destroy me. But still looking at any opportunity to get up there. But no, I'm incredibly excited. I don't think Ryan Poles was on a lot of people's radars until just recently. Obviously, he was kind of a name that was getting tossed around in the initial GM net that was cast, the incredibly wide net. But, there were names and guys like Rick Smith, who, of course, was kind of a long shot, Amir Khan, even Joe Shane, who's getting thrown around. So for the Bears to kind of pivot, and by the way, Ryan Poles was supposed to be with Minnesota just tomorrow, right? And they're interviewing one of the first guys that we interviewed, Adolfo Mensa. And the concept of us immediately basically giving him a term sheet and saying, hey, you're not taking that next flight to Minneapolis is pretty great. Because I think that there is some rivalry going on there as well. Just kind of, a FTV little situation going on. But no, I'm incredibly excited. Today, we're just going to break down real quickly for you guys our initial thoughts and reaction. We're lining up some more deep analysis on who Ryan is. We're bringing some interesting guests, as Usayd just shared with me before the show, which is super exciting. So make sure you follow if you'd like to learn more about our new general manager. But like you mentioned, they don't have to change the nameplates at Hallis Hall. They can keep Ryan P for everything if they want to, right?
Right. And, the other media outlet I work for, Bear Report, I do the podcast there. It was originally Picks for Pace. And then when Pace got fired, we were all like, all right, we have to rebrand, but we're going to go ahead and wait until a general manager is hired. So we went from Picks for Pace to Picks for Polls. But listen, just getting funny the way things work out. Now, when you kind of get into this hire, it's interesting because I was talking to someone today after the news had broke, and they asked me a very simple question. They were like, what are your thoughts on the new guy? And I kind of talked about how compared to Ryan Pace, Ryan Poles has been under 3 or 4 leadership regimes and leadership teams in Kansas City. I mean, we look at the Saints today, which, by the way, congrats to Sean Payton on a phenomenal run in New Orleans. Okay, he really changed that city for the better, and just that team in general, and the outlook of the Saints. But kind of getting back to it, you look at Ryan Pace. He was in New Orleans. He started at the very bottom and just worked under Mickey Loomis for such a long time. And then there is Ryan Poles, who was kind of in Kansas City since basically 2009, 2010, and then went ahead and worked under guys like Scott Pioli, and then you had the John Dorsey years, and then along with, the Brett Veach years. And, when you begin to kind of look at the Brett Veach tree, you really see it's beginning to branch off because you do have really intriguing candidates. Like last year at this time, when we were kind of last year, I want to say, towards the end of the 2020 season, when we were talking about the possibility of a guy like a Ryan Pace being fired, Mike Borgonzi, who's also in the Chiefs front office, he was being floated around as a name. And so I think this is a great hire because when you look at Poles' background, you realize it is diverse. It's very rare for teams and a single candidate to go ahead and to survive basically 3 or 4 leadership changes. And then you just look at his football background. I mean, you're talking about someone who's on his second stint in Chicago, by the way, because he was an undrafted free agent in 2008, signed with the Bears. He's an offensive lineman, blocked for guys like Matt Ryan, who I think is going to make a phenomenal QB coach someday. Just throwing it out there as his career in Atlanta winds down. But overall, it's a great hire, because when you look at Poles just over last offseason in Kansas City, something you notice very quickly is that he basically rebuilt that Chiefs offensive line. The Chiefs offensive line, they were forced to play with a makeshift line in the Super Bowl. And again, their starting five, I think last season in 2020 was never necessarily a weakness, but it wasn't a major strength either. And because they were forced to play with backups, Ryan Poles said, "Give me the keys to this OL. Bye bye Mitchell Schwartz. Bye bye Eric Fisher. We're moving on from you guys. Hello Joe Thuney. Hello former Bears guard Kyle Long, who has not been able to stay healthy. What's up, Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith in the second and third round. Hello Nick Bolton." So he's really been an instrumental voice in those draft rooms over the last couple seasons. And guess what? Whether you want to admit or not, the Chiefs, I think, are getting up there with teams like the Steelers and the Ravens in terms of just putting together consistently good draft classes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Chiefs' success speaks for itself, right? But what does that speak to? It speaks to organizations drafting good players and surrounding them with one another, right? Which is kind of what Ryan Poles' job was. We look at Ryan Pace's experience, we look at Ryan Poles' experience. They're basically, one to one here. Just one was in New Orleans and the other was in Kansas City. Ryan Poles gets me excited because we look at a guy who is integral in drafting Patrick Mahomes, but also drafting talent to surround him, be it from the offensive line to also the weapons, right? We look at the Chiefs and we look at success in late rounds just as much as the Bears have. And that's something that I think will be continuity. But what I want to frame this Ryan Poles hire is nice and simple. And I swear this is exactly what happened was he gave the best outline for how to develop the team around the stars that they have right now, right? Which was what he did in Kansas City. So having that experience to help build Patrick Mahomes into alongside coaching staff, correct, into the superstar, future mini GOAT that he is, as some claim, that experience definitely helps him when he's interviewing and they go, "Well, what do you want to do with Justin Fields?" Right? Or do you have a plan with our current quarterback? And he goes, "Well, yes, actually, I have a great plan with the current quarterback. And it's let me do my job and you guys do your job and worry about this new stadium or ticket sales." Right? And you won't even have to worry about ticket sales by the time I'm done because everybody in the Midwest is going to want to come see a Bears game because Justin Fields is putting up ridiculous numbers with Darnell Mooney and future talent to come. So, there's nothing that really is glaring here for me. And looking at the experience of Ryan Poles, this is a really interesting note that this is the second time that the Chicago Bears in the past decade, or I guess 20 years now, or out of the past three GMs, we'll say that two of them were scouts for Kansas City or high level scouts, right? Of course, talk about Phil Emery, who was Ryan Poles' first boss, by the way. So there's this interesting trend that I think we need to start recognizing for future searches, that the Bears like to tap Kansas City a lot for talent in the front office. I think it's a little interesting to me and I'm sure I'm positive that Matt Nagy was also contacted as well because there was overlap there. That if anybody had any contact with this guy, they would get reached out to by George McCaskey and the rest of the crew. But there's so many connections to Kansas City that eventually it starts getting a little bit repetitive. I think there might be, if there is any caveat for people to be cautiously optimistic about, I think it's the track record of Kansas City Chiefs front office, personnel and Bears front office track history. But, if there's a guy to break this, I think it's him, with all the reports coming out saying that he's demanding to have more of a say in who's going to be the head coach and kind of standing up to the ownership. I think that's incredibly imponent to who he is as a guy, right? Because obviously he's an ex-player. And he has this fantastic quote that I'm sure everyone's seen by now about locker room culture, right? And he's a guy that's really player first, player centric. And I know a lot of the players were hoping for Champ Kelly to get the job, and I'm not sure if Champ Kelly stays in Hallis Hall next year with some of the interviews that he's had. But I think this guy is definitely going to be a player favorite because he says it as it is, and he seems like he's a guy who genuinely cares about locker rooms because he's been in one, which is rare, I feel, for general managers.
And you talk about kind of going back to Kansas City and it getting repetitive. A lot of Bears fans were skeptical of not just I don't want to say necessarily the Ryan Poles hire, but just going back to a team like Kansas City or a team like New Orleans or a team like the Indianapolis Colts. Because, when you look at teams like the Saints and Colts, obviously, the Bears did their homework on candidates from both places. And while there is a chance that Matt Eberflus, the Colts defensive coordinator, gets hired, we have to keep something in mind is that none of the guys on the Colts, or as in terms of GM candidates, or the Saints particularly blew me away. Now, Jeff Ireland, I was very skeptical of because, again, like the Bears just hired the last GM the Bears hired was from New Orleans, and then look at how Pace turned out. And then what had happened is that the Jeff Ireland interviews were just a complete waste of time because Jeff Ireland had already failed as a general manager. And by the way, the league is kind of continuing to trend towards, oh, yeah, I understand you were a GM or a head coach once before, but you know what? Unless you really blow us away, you're not really a strong candidate, okay? We'll talk later about how Dan Quinn's the exception sometime this week, maybe. But the point is, I think, is that when you look at this, right, Kansas City, the talent that's come out of that head coach, look, let me clarify it this way. The talent that's come out of Kansas City in the front office has been top tier, okay? And I don't think there's a better organization right now in terms of cranking out front office talent. The problem, though, that a lot of people have with just going back to the Chiefs is simply they're not really sure whether anyone wants to go back to the Andy Reid coaching tree. It's the same reason that Eric Bieniemy over the last basically 3 or 4 years has kind of been labeled as, well, he's the next guy in the Andy Reid coaching tree after Doug Peterson and Matt Nagy that is just so sure to have a head coaching job. And yet the NFL has clearly shown that there's something about Eric Bieniemy the rest of us may not necessarily know, or the rest of us do know, but he's not the high profile candidate that fans are making him out to be. So when you ultimately look at this, right, you have to realize is that the talent in the front office in Kansas City is great. What comes off the coaching staff and Andy Reid's tree is not necessarily the best on the planet. And again, when you do look at the Andy Reid coaching tree, I mean, there's some really nice names on there. You got, John Harbaugh, Sean McDermott, Ron Rivera. Well, guess what? Those guys are all defensive minded or special teams coaches, right? Or their backgrounds in special teams. The thing with the Andy Reid coaching tree is that the offensive guys outside of Doug Peterson simply have not worked out, or they just have been lauded as the next big things, and then they've gone somewhere and they just have not lived up to expectations or completely failed. And so I think what's going to happen is when we talk about who Ryan Poles is going to hire as a head coach, I think he's going to go in a bit of a different direction, even though, and again, we're recording this about 4.5 hours after the Ryan Poles hire was announced. I think what's going to happen is, he's going to want to go in a different direction and not necessarily go back to Eric Bieniemy or the Chiefs, simply because there's already chatter out there about, well, what about Eric Bieniemy as a head coach? I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's two names you need to watch. I understand Jim Caldwell's been floated, but if I had to do a power rankings, I would say Brian Flores, Dan Quinn, and then Matt Eberflus. And the reason Flores is at the top of that list is simply because his connection with Poles is something that's legitimately going to matter, because you need to have a head coach and GM that see eye to eye on everything.
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. And I mean, it was reported that we don't know if this is true or not, but it was reported at least that GMs and head coaching candidates were communicating with each other in interview processes, that the committee to select at House Hall were having conversations simultaneously with candidates on each side of the ball, seeing how they would interact with each other. And I think that's an incredibly smart move, because obviously you don't want to bring in a GM and a head coach that just don't click. You want to have them same page, so when we hit the ground running, and we're able to make up as much ground as humanly possible, right? So when I look at Ryan Poles and I look at any of the names on the list, and I'm sure we won't have a head coach for a couple more days at least, I look at a list that will most likely be expanded, right? The names that you just floated, Brian Flores wasn't on the final list, but that's definitely something I feel is going to be expanded. One of the other reports is that Ryan Poles said that he wants to interview the final candidates that the committee has selected, and that if he feels as if one of them isn't good enough that he was going to request to expand the pool and bring somebody else in. So I think there's definitely room for him to maneuver towards Brian Flores or anyone else that he may have good connections with. But no, you're completely right. I think if there's anyone in the Flores camp that was really, hankering for Brian Flores to become the head coach for Chicago Bears, this was probably the best GM for us to bring in just to make that a reality. I mean, there's still New York and us really when it comes down to any of the places that or the two places that he could land at this point. And I just think that there's more of a connection, more of a reason to, more of a willingness for him to come to Chicago. The only downside is he can't pick his quarterback. He has to absolutely adore Justin Fields. And what we've seen so far is he does, right? The bonus for him going to New York is you have two top 5 picks or 2 top 10 picks. There's not a great quarterback draft class this year, but maybe we take a shot on one of these QBs. Mitch Trubisky's probably going to be gone at the end of the year. He might be starting somewhere else, maybe New Orleans, who knows? And there's just all these different things to consider between the New York Giants and the Chicago Bears. But I still think Brian Flores ends up in Chicago.
Yeah, and again, earlier I mentioned Sean Payton. I want to bring something up is that there's only 2 teams who have gone out and hired GM so far. Okay, the Bears as well as the New York Giants. Okay, the Minnesota Vikings, they're closing in on Adolfo Mensa, but I don't know necessarily, and that news hasn't officially broken that they're closing in on him. And so when you look at this head coaching cycle that's kind of taking place, there's no team has their head coach set in stone yet. And so it's important to realize and understand that the Saints just lost Sean Payton today. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the Saints are going to be in line for one of these head coaches, that are being floated around like a Nathaniel Hackett. I certainly think that Dennis Allen, who was supposed to interview in Chicago on Tuesday, but I believe now he's going to interview later on in the week as a result of the Bears just wanting to get that deal with Ryan Poles done. What will happen is Dennis Allen's a favorite for that New Orleans job because he's been there since 2015 or 2016. And then when you look around to the Giants, I mean, I think that the team that's going to hire a head coach first is either going to be the Bears or the Giants. I do not see the Jacksonville Jaguars kind of moving as fast as everyone anticipates. And what's interesting about the Jags is that they've been the only team that's just been relatively quiet. They have their GM in place, but again, they're not really sure if they want to go, the direction of Doug Peterson or Caldwell or Byron Leftwich, or even a Todd Bowles. I know Bill O'Brien was floated around in that name too. And then the Denver Broncos, reports out of Denver suggest that it's going to be Nathaniel Hackett and that he could possibly bring Packers quarterback coach Luke Getsy with him and make him the offensive coordinator there. And then also,
and maybe Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, maybe Aaron Rodgers too. The Broncos just have this thing where it's like if they don't hit on a franchise QB, then they have to go to, other teams to find a franchise QB. Like it was John Elway too, I think was drafted by the Colts and traded to the Broncos. And then Peyton Manning and now Aaron Rodgers is maybe next in line. But then you look at the Vikings, the Vikings and Bears candidates have kind of intermingled and intermixed here, but again, it's not necessarily, you would give the Bears the hand up because I just wrote a piece on FireSideBears.com, and one of the big things that I basically talked about was one big decision for each NFC North team. And the big decision for the Vikings is, hey, we're locked into, I think it's $45 million of Kirk Cousins' contract in 2022. You can't get out of it at all. So you're basically stuck with Kirk Cousins for a year, and then you get to start over in 2023, essentially. And so, again, the Raiders as well, they've been floated around to have a couple names, but the Bears clearly have one of the most attractive openings on the market because when you look at all these teams, you could argue this right now, the Bears have the most talented roster of any of these guys. Okay, the talent, the upside, the potential is there. The major pieces. You talk about having 2 really good pass rushers, a stud middle linebacker, and ascending cornerback. The Bears are able to offer that. You look at the offensive side of the ball. The quarterback of the future is already in place. You've got a really good wide receiver in Darnell Mooney. Okay, you have 2 really good running backs in Damian Williams, well, three, I should say, with Williams, Montgomery, and Herbert. And then your tackles of the future are already in place. And so when you look at this, right, you realize and understand that the upside is certainly there for the Bears to have a quick turnaround. It's just going to be a matter of what is Ryan Poles necessarily looking for, and then moving from there. And also, side note, it's going to take lots of getting used to say Ryan Poles and not Ryan Pace, because I've nearly said Pace like six
Right.
times already.
Yeah, no, 100%. All that and more. The Broncos are definitely an interesting team, I think, to keep an eye on over the next couple of days. No one really knows what's coming out of Jacksonville. I think that's just because of the size of media there, right? Like, it's kind of an unfortunate reality. But hopefully, again, and we had a great interview with Ashlyn Sullivan, who works for the organization over the summer, and just how excited that they were to have Trevor Lawrence and Urban Meyer in town. And unfortunately, it didn't shake out as well as they wanted it to, but there's still a good amount of talent in Jacksonville to build upon. So I wouldn't write them out for netting a really solid head coach candidate here. But what it also looks like is they need to completely sweep the front office, but that probably won't happen for some time. Yeah, it's just thinking here real quickly is, now that we have our general manager, we can really start looking at potential player acquisitions and moves, right? Like, that's absolutely crucial before we even start looking at free agency, before we start looking at re-signing any of the players. So we're looking at potential trades, right, as we enter the draft. We're not in any really position to move up in the draft. I don't think that Ryan Poles would want to do that. But what's also interesting to me is an entire scouting staff already spent about a year scouting for Ryan Pace and his team's draft, right? It's interesting to look at what Ryan Poles does with that information. Does he send scouts back out there? Is he trying to get new evaluations? Like, that's something that I think people have to consider, is the downside of firing at the end of the season, because being a GM is a 365-day job, right? Whereas being a head coach is, you're really, really, really working hard during the regular season, and in the off season, it's not as hard. It's still your job, right? But being a general manager there's operations every single day that you need to consider. You're always looking at players. You're always looking at potential talent. So this is just an interesting position for Poles to be in. But like you mentioned with the Vikings, if it came down to just comparing the X's and O's, it's clear that Chicago is just in a better position thanks to Ryan Pace. And the job that he did, I'll still always think of him very favorably. I don't think there's any animosity from me towards Ryan Pace. I still hope he ends up somewhere in the NFL. I think he still has a great career ahead of him. Because by no means was this a big failure, right? It's hard to think of Ryan Pace as a failure by the record that he produced while he was here and the roster he was able to build. So there are definitely a lot of question marks moving forward, but I don't think I'm just excited to see where we go from here, but I'm still very confident. And this is what I'm going to say moving forward, that Ryan Poles was brought in because they thought he was the right guy to surround Justin Fields with talent and weapons, and to surround this young offensive core outside of Justin Fields. Let's just envelop it all together, shall we? That he's going to be the guy that really builds this offense into what this team needs to dominate in the NFC North, to dominate the NFC, and get us to a Super Bowl in the near future.
And again, we'll do this a bit later in the offseason, where we kind of talk to other beat writers that cover other NFC North teams, kind of get the inside scoop on what's going on there as we continue to do, all the stuff that we do here. But I also, just one final point from me is that something to watch out for is in these head coaching hires that are going to take place beginning on Wednesday, January 26th, where it's only going to be Ryan Poles in the room, is there a chance that Poles decides, hey, I do want to hire someone like Dan Quinn, simply because I think having that veteran experience and someone that may have an eye for developing talent can really be of use to me. And then just a quick second point too. Ultimately, you touch on the Ryan Pace era. Like I said, I don't think the Pace era was necessarily a failure. He had his hits. He had his misses, like every GM does when you are 7 years into the job. But then also, again, you look around the league and there's not a lot of GMs that are going to walk into a situation that the Bears have in terms of the foundation's already there. And now it just needs a couple roster tweaks. And, you mentioned the scouting too. Listen, I actually think that keeping a guy like a Champ Kelly and Mark Sadowski and even Joey Lane, those three names that were basically the 2, 3, and 4 under Ryan Pace in the chain of command, that actually works to Ryan Pohl's advantage, if we're being honest, because those are the three people in the building that are going to have sound football knowledge of how this roster was constructed and how to kind of move forward based off what was seen in the 2021 season well before that. And I think Poles has to understand something is that he doesn't have to make this team, he doesn't have to tear it all down and make this the Ryan Poles Bears. No, he can just fine tune and tweak it. And you know what? The Bears could be set up for success moving forward.
Yeah, no, there's not a whole lot of machinery for him to move around, and it's not like he's inheriting a lemon. He's inheriting a what should I say, like a nice 2013 like Ford Escape. Like it could be better, it could be worse, but it's something, and you could always trade it in and maybe work on something better. So we love our car analogies here on this channel. The Ryan Poles, I think, is a perfect hire. I have no issues with it. There are some concerns. I wanted a more analytical guy, but we got another player development guy, which at the end of the day is fine. It's what the Bears have done for a long time, and it's produced some sort of a result. Now we just need to ensure that we bring in the right guy to help mold this young core of guys. Another guy that shares the same locker room vision as Ryan Poles. And I have a feeling that Poles is going to be a lot more involved in player personnel and player decisions, or at least player interactions, than Ryan Pace was. I know that there are videos of Ryan Pace meeting with some of the guys that they were signing and all that jazz, but I have a good feeling that Ryan Poles is one of those guys that may be on the sidelines during game, or maybe on the sidelines during practices. That's interacting with the players every day. And, if you have a guy like Champ Kelly, if you're somehow able to keep him there, and you got a guy like Ryan Poles, you're building a really good culture that players want to be a part of in Chicago. And I think that's something that we may not have seen in a long time, especially with all these Bears alumni coming out and kind of sharing their stories. This is a good, I think, turn in the right direction for Chicago Bears as an organizational culture aspect. And I think this is a quality stand-up guy that they brought in. And I'm really excited to see where we go from here.
Yep, and we're excited too, guys. But listen, check back with us on Thursday night or Friday morning for a really special interview that we're going to be dropping, where it's going to be the inside scoop on Ryan Poles. But for now, guys, we are going to get out of here. Make sure you're following us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Fireside Bears. Make sure you're following myself and Max on social media at Max SmithESM and at Usayd Koshal. We'll catch you guys on the flip side. Bear down, stay warm, stay safe, and welcome to the Ryan Poles era, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully it results in a couple Lombardis, but peace out, guys.